The dust tasted of grit and grief, a fine red powder that clung to Lorena Bishop's black mourning dress and coated her tongue. For 6 months since the day they'd buried what was left of her husband, Frank, the Arizona sun had been a merciless tyrant, baking the hope from her bones. The silence of their homestead was a living thing, broken only by the buzz of flies and the lonely creak of the porch swing. Then he came. Not a man, but a mountain carved from sinew and stone, astride a paint horse that seemed impossibly small beneath him. His name was Natchok, and his shadow fell over her entire world. He said nothing, his obsidian eyes drinking in her despair, until he finally spoke, his voice a low rumble of thunder. By winter, the giant Apache vowed his words a brand on the stillness. You'll have my son growing inside you. Lorena's world shrank to the space between one ragged breath and the next. The shotgun, Frank's old, reliable Winchester, was just inside the door, but it felt a world away. Her hand, resting on the porch rail, trembled so violently she had to grip the splintered wood to keep from collapsing. He was magnificent and terrifying, taller than any man she'd ever seen, with shoulders that strained the seams of his deerskin vest. His face was a mask of hard angles and sun-baked copper, framed by 2 long, thick braids of hair, so black it seemed to drink the light. A single eagle feather was tied at the end of one braid. His eyes, though, were what held her captive. They weren't filled with the wild, unthinking hate she'd been taught to expect. They were intelligent, ancient, and held a chilling certainty. Behind him, a dozen more warriors sat on their horses, silent and stoic, their presence a suffocating weight on the already oppressive air. They were ghosts from the stories whispered in Dust Devil Gulch, the specters that haunted the dreams of every isolated homesteader, the men who she believed had made her a widow. What did you say? She stammered the words, barely a whisper. Natchok dismounted in a single fluid motion. He moved with a predator's grace that belied his immense size. Each step toward the porch was deliberate, a drumbeat, marking the end of her life as she knew it. He stopped at the bottom step, forcing her to look down at him, a position of power she felt with every fiber of her being. My brother Tarza died on this land, he said, his English clipped and heavy with an accent she couldn't place, but each word was clear as a funeral bell. Your husband's rifle fired the shot. A life for a life, a bloodline for a bloodline. His spirit wanders unavenged. It will not be settled with your death. Death is too simple. It will be settled with life. My life joined with yours. He gestured to her flat belly, a gesture so intimate and possessive it made her skin crawl. His blood was spilled into this dust. My blood will be planted in you. A new life will grow. A son. By winter you will carry him. This is our way. This is justice. Tears of rage and terror burned her eyes. You murdering savage. You killed my Frank. You rode down on him and left him for the coyotes. And now you dare. She choked on her own fury, unable to form the words for the violation he was promising. A flicker of something, was it surprise, contempt, crossed his face. Your husband was not alone. He met us with fire. We answered. Now the debt is owed. He looked around at the small, struggling homestead. The parched corn stalks the leaky water barrel, the sagging porch roof. It was a testament to her failure, her inability to hold back the wilderness Frank had tried to tame. Natchok's gaze seemed to see it all, to see the desperation she tried so hard to hide when she rode into town for supplies. You are alone, he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. This land is dying. You are dying with it. You have nothing. I have my honor. She spat, finding a sliver of Frank's stubborn pride within her. "And I'll die before I let a heathen like you touch me." He took a step up, and she recoiled as if struck. He was so close now she could smell the scent of horse, and leather and something else, something wild and clean like pine needles after a rain. His shadow engulfed her completely. "Dying is easy," he murmured, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "Living is the challenge. You will live, and you will be the mother of my son." He turned then, without another word, and swung himself back onto his horse. He and his warriors didn't ride away. They moved to the small creek that bordered her property, a thin ribbon of life that was the only reason the homestead existed at all. They began to make camp. Lorena stood frozen on the porch, his words echoing in the vast, terrible silence. "By winter you'll have my son growing inside you." It wasn't just a threat. It was a prophecy. He wasn't going to raid her home or drag her away. He was going to wait. He was going to watch her a spider, watching a fly struggle in its web, waiting for the moment she finally broke. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody fingers of light across the valley, Lorena Bishop knew she was no longer just a widow. She was a prisoner on her own land. The days that followed bled into a week, then two, each one, a masterclass in psychological torment. Nachok and his men were a constant, silent presence at the edge of her world. They never crossed the invisible line onto her immediate property, but their camp by the creek was a stark reminder of their purpose. She watched them through the grimy panes of her cabin window, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. They were not the lazy, whooping savages of penny dreadfuls. There was a discipline to their camp, a quiet order that unsettled her more than open aggression would have. They tended their horses, cleaned their weapons, and spoke in low, guttural tones that the wind carried to her like whispers from a nightmare. Nachok himself was often visible sometimes, sitting motionless for hours, staring at her cabin as if he could see through the walls and into her very soul. Other times he would train with a bow, the power in his massive frame, evident as he drew the string back, his muscles coiling like a panther's. Lorena's life became a cramped, fearful routine. She did her chores with the shotgun always close at hand, her eyes constantly scanning the cottonwood trees that lined the creek. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her. Sleep was a luxury, coming only in short, fitful bursts, filled with visions of his dark, unreadable eyes. Her supplies began to dwindle. The flour sack was nearly empty, and the salted pork was down to its last slab. A trip to Dust Devil Gulch was necessary, a journey of half a day, that now seemed as perilous as crossing an ocean. What would they do when she left? Would they burn her cabin? Or worse, would they follow her? One morning her resolve hardened by hunger. She hitched her weary old mule Daisy to the buckboard. With the shotgun loaded and lying on the seat beside her, she urged Daisy forward, her jaw set. As she passed the creek, she could feel their eyes on her. She refused to look, keeping her gaze fixed on the dusty track ahead. She expected them to give chase, to hear the thunder of hooves behind her. But there was only silence. The trip to town was agonizing. Every rock formation, every stand of mesquite seemed to be a potential ambush site. By the time the ramshackle buildings of Dust Devil Gulch came into view, her nerves were frayed raw. The town was a collection of dusty storefronts and false-fronted saloons populated by weary prospectors, hardened cowboys, and suspicious townsfolk. At the general store, the proprietor, a portly man named Peter Finch, eyed her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. "Heard you got some trouble out your way, Lorena," he said, weighing a sack of flour. Word traveled fast in the desert. "I'm fine, Peter," she said, her voice tight. Some folks saw smoke from an Apache camp near your claim. He pressed, lowering his voice. Sheriff Porter ain't keen on riding out that way. Says it's county business, but we all know he's yellow. Her heart sank. She was truly on her own. As she was loading her supplies, another man approached her. Corbin Wexler. Wexler was a rancher whose land bordered her own. He was a man who dressed in fine clothes that always seemed out of place in the dust, his smile too slick, his eyes too cold. He had made offers on her land before Frank died, and had renewed them with barely disguised impatience after the funeral. "Mrs. Bishop," he said, tipping his hat. His cologne was cloying in the dry air. "A lady like yourself shouldn't be making this trip alone, especially with renegades about." "I can manage Mr. Wexler," she replied coolly. "Nonsense," he insisted, his smile not reaching his eyes. "That land, it's too much for you. The water rights to that creek alone are valuable. I'd still be willing to take it off your hands, give you a fair price. You could move into town. Be safe. The land is not for sale. It was my husband's." Wexler's smile tightened. "Your husband is dead, ma'am. Pride don't fill a belly or stop a bullet. You think on my offer." He sauntered away, leaving a trail of unease in his wake. The ride home was just as tense, but when she arrived, the cabin was untouched. Her small flock of chickens was clucking in their coop, and nothing was out of place. Relief warred with confusion. The next morning, she discovered a freshly killed deer lying by her woodpile. It was cleaned and dressed a fortune in fresh meat. There were no tracks, no sign of who had left it, but she knew. It was him. Nachok. She stared at the carcass for a long time, the shotgun in her hands. It was a gift, but it felt like a chain. He wasn't just threatening her. He was providing for her. He was showing her in his own silent, arrogant way that he could do what she and the dying land could not. He could sustain life. It was a terrifying form of courtship, a demonstration of his power and her dependence. A few days later, the pump for her, well a rickety contraption Frank had cobbled together, finally gave out with a sickening crunch of rusted metal. It was her only source of clean water, besides the creek, and the creek was their territory. Despair, sharp and bitter, washed over her. This was the end. She couldn't fix it. She sat on her porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, feeling utterly defeated. When darkness fell, she went inside, too broken to even bar the door. She woke just before dawn to a strange sound, a rhythmic clanging of metal on metal. Peeking through the window, her heart hammering, she saw a figure at the well. It was Nachok. In the pale pre-dawn light, she could see the powerful muscles of his back and arms working as he manipulated the pump's broken handle. He had a few simple tools laid out beside him. For over an hour she watched, hidden in the shadows of her home, as the giant Apache methodically and with surprising skill repaired her well pump. When he was finished, he worked the handle. The familiar, beautiful squeak was followed by a gush of clear, life-giving water. He drank from his cupped hands, then, without a single glance toward the cabin, walked back to his camp. Lorena slowly opened her door and approached the well. The repair was solid, the metal brace he'd fashioned stronger than the original part. He was systematically dismantling her independence piece by piece. He wasn't a jailer who kept her locked in. He was a warden who was slowly making the prison a better place to live. And that, she realized with a cold dread, was infinitely more dangerous. He wasn't just waiting for her to break. He was waiting for her to need him. The heat of late summer intensified, turning the valley into a furnace. The silent war of wills between the lonely cabin and the Apache camp stretched on. Lorena had taken to using the meat from the deer and the water from the repaired well small surrenders that tasted like ash in her mouth. She hated her reliance on him, yet she couldn't deny the grim reality of her situation. Without his silent provisions, she would have failed already. The breaking point came not from a man, but from the land itself. She was clearing brush from near the chicken coop, a thankless, sweaty task when she failed to see the diamondback rattlesnake coiled in the shade of a sagebrush. She heard the dry, terrifying buzz an instant before it struck. A white-hot pain seared her calf, and she screamed, stumbling backward and falling hard into the dust. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She scrambled away, her eyes fixed on the snake as it slithered back into the undergrowth. Looking down, she saw the 2 small puncture marks on her leg already beginning to swell and discolor. She knew what it meant. Out here alone, a bite like that was a death sentence. Tears streaming down her face, she half-crawled, half-limped back to the cabin, her leg throbbing with a venomous fire. She fumbled inside, collapsing onto the floor. She thought of Frank, of the promises they had made to build a life here. It was all ending in a dusty, ignominious heap. Suddenly the doorway was blocked, a giant silhouette against the blinding sun. It was Natchok. He must have heard her scream. He stepped inside, his eyes immediately finding her on the floor, then darting to her injured leg. For the first time, she saw something other than stoic certainty in his expression. It was a focused urgency. "Stay still," he commanded, his voice sharp. He knelt beside her, pulling a long, wicked-looking knife from a sheath on his belt. Lorena flinched, dragging herself backward. "No, get away from me." He ignored her, grabbing her ankle with a grip of iron. "The poison will reach your heart. You have little time." Without further ceremony, he made 2 quick, shallow cuts over the bite marks, creating a small X. Before she could protest, he lowered his head and put his mouth to the wound. Lorena cried out a mix of revulsion and terror as he began to suck the venom from her flesh, spitting the poisoned blood onto the cabin's floorboards. The intimacy of the act was shocking, a violation as profound as the one he had vowed to commit. Yet it was an act to save her life. He worked for several minutes, his focus absolute. When he was done, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He then rose and went to her fireplace, grabbing a handful of herbs from a pouch at his waist and mixing them with water from her bucket. He returned with a poultice of crushed green leaves and mud, which he packed firmly onto the wound. The strange mixture was surprisingly cool and soothing. He lifted her as easily as if she were a child and carried her to her bed. He laid her down gently, then stood back, watching her. Her head was spinning her leg a dull, heavy ache. "You will be weak," he said. "You must sweat the poison out." He covered her with every blanket she owned, despite the stifling heat in the cabin. Then he sat in the single wooden chair in the corner of the room, his knife resting on his knee, and began his vigil. For 2 days he did not leave. He brought her water, forcing her to drink. He changed the poultice on her leg. He sat in silence, a stoic guardian, while she drifted in and out of a feverish delirium. In her moments of lucidity, she would see him there, a solid, unmoving presence in the dim light, and a strange, terrifying sense of security would wash over her before the fever dragged her back under. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. She woke up drenched in sweat, weak and shaky, but her mind was clear. The swelling in her leg had gone down, and the terrible pain had subsided to a manageable throb. He was still there in the chair, watching her. Why, she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Why did you save me?" He rose and came to the bedside, looking down at her. A dead mother cannot bear a son. The brutal honesty of it should have angered her, but she was too weary. She had been so certain he was a monster, a creature of pure malice. But a monster would have let the snake finish its work. A monster wouldn't have tended to her with such patient care. "My husband," she began, needing to understand. "You said he killed your brother, Tarza." Nachok nodded slowly. "There was a raid. Not by us. We were tracking the men who did it. Men on shod horses. White men. They raided a camp of the Chiricahua people, old ones and women. They stole horses. We tracked them to this valley. Your husband was with them." Lorena's world tilted on its axis. "No, that's not possible. Frank, he wouldn't do that. He was a good man." "He was with them," Nachok repeated, his voice, flat without judgment. "We cornered them by the rocks to the south. There was a fight. Your husband was a good shot. He hit Tarza from a great distance. We killed the others. But your husband, he got away wounded. He made it back here before he died." Suddenly fragmented memories slotted into place. Frank stumbling home late one night, claiming he'd been thrown from his horse. His feverish insistence that she tell no one he'd been gone. The pouch of gold coins she found in his saddlebag, coins he claimed he'd won in a lucky poker game. The men he had been with. Rough men from Wexler's ranch. Corbin Wexler. Pride don't fill a belly or stop a bullet. It was Wexler she breathed, the realization a punch to the gut. Frank was working for him. Wexler wanted this land. The water. He must have sent Frank with those men. She looked up at Nachok, her eyes wide with the horror of the truth. Frank hadn't been defending his home from savages. He'd been the savage. He'd been a raider and a killer. Her hatred for Nachok, the bedrock of her existence for weeks, crumbled into dust, leaving a hollow ache of shame and misplaced grief. She hadn't been mourning a hero. She had been mourning a man she didn't even know. "My brother was young," Nachok said, his voice softer now, tinged with a deep, resonant sadness. "He had a wife, a child on the way. His life was stolen. Your husband's debt is real." Lorena looked at the giant man before her, no longer seeing a monster. She saw a man bound by grief and a code of honor she couldn't possibly comprehend. A man who had lost a brother, just as she had lost a husband. The vow he had made no longer sounded like a simple threat of violence. It was something far more ancient, more complex. It was a terrible, unbreakable knot tying their two shattered lives together. The truth settled over the small cabin like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. Everything Lorena thought she knew about her life, her husband, and her place in this harsh land had been a lie. Frank, the man she had loved and grieved, had been a pawn in a rich man's cruel game and had died a thief and a killer. The shame was a physical weight pressing down on her chest. Her recovery was slow. Nachok continued to care for her, his presence no longer a source of terror, but of a deeply unsettling comfort. He would hunt, leaving rabbits or quail on her doorstep. He spoke little, but when he did, it was to ask if she needed water or to tell her which herbs would help with the pain. A strange, unspoken truce formed between them, born from her medical crisis and his startling revelation. One afternoon, as she was sitting on the porch, her bandaged leg propped up on a stool, she saw riders approaching. It wasn't Nachok's warriors. It was Corbin Wexler and two of his hired guns. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. Wexler reined in his horse, his eyes taking in her weakened state with predatory satisfaction. "Mrs. Bishop, I see you've had some trouble. A fall, perhaps?" "I'm fine, Mr. Wexler," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Are you?" he asked, his slick smile returning. "Because I hear different. I hear you've taken in a rather unusual house guest. the chief of the band that's been terrorizing this valley. His words were a clear threat. He was painting her as a sympathizer, an outcast. In this part of the country, such an accusation could be a death sentence. "I don't know what you're talking about." She lied, her gaze unwavering. Wexler laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Don't play coy, Lorena. We all know the Apache are camped on your creek, and we all know why they're here. Because of your husband. Frank was a fool, got himself killed meddling in affairs that were too rich for his blood." He spat on the ground near her porch. "But his foolishness presents an opportunity. The army's been looking for an excuse to clear these hills. A white woman living under the protection of a savage chief. That's just the excuse they need. They'll burn this whole valley to the ground to save you." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Or you could be smart. Sign this land over to me. I'll tell the sheriff you were being held captive, that I bravely ran the Indians off. You walk away with a pocketful of cash, and I get what's mine. Everyone wins." "What's yours?" she asked, her voice dripping with contempt. "This land was never yours. This land has water." Wexler snapped his facade of civility cracking. "And in this territory, whoever controls the water controls everything. Your husband understood that. He was willing to do what was necessary to get a piece of it. It was a confession, a casual admission that he had sent Frank on the raid that cost Taza his life, and ultimately Frank's own. The last vestiges of Lorena's old life burned away in a flash of pure, righteous anger. "You killed him," she said, her voice low and shaking with rage. "You sent him to do your dirty work, and you got him killed." Wexler shrugged. He knew the risks. "Now are you going to be sensible, or do I have to be persuasive?" As if on cue, one of his men dismounted, a length of rope in his hand and a brutish grin on his face. They were going to force her. Before the man could take a step onto the porch, a voice, deep and resonant, cut through the air. "She has given you her answer." Nachok emerged from the side of the cabin, moving with a silent, deadly speed that was terrifying to behold. He hadn't been in the camp. He had been close by, watching. In his hand, he held a war axe, its polished stone head gleaming in the sun. Two of his warriors appeared behind him, materializing from the landscape, as if from thin air bows, drawn arrows aimed at the chests of Wexler's men. Wexler's face went pale. His bravado evaporated in the face of the giant Apache leader. "This is between me and the woman, Chief," he stammered. "Her land is under my protection," Nachok stated calmly. "Her life is a debt owed to my people. You will not touch her. You will not touch this land. You will leave. Now." Wexler's man with the rope dropped it and scrambled back to his horse. The rancher's eyes darted between Nachok and his warriors, his mind calculating odds he clearly didn't like. "This isn't over," he snarled, pulling on his horse's reins. "I'll bring the law down on all of you. You'll hang for this, you and your savage-loving whore." He spurred his horse, and he and his men galloped away in a cloud of dust and impotent threats. Lorena was breathing heavily, her hands clenched into fists. She looked at Nachok, who was still watching the riders retreat, his expression unreadable. He had defended her. He had claimed her and her land as his own, not just with a vow, but with a direct challenge to the white man, who was her true enemy. "He'll be back," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He'll bring more men. Or the army." Nachok turned to her, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Let him come," he said simply. "This land has now seen the blood of my brother and the blood of my enemy. We will not surrender it." In that moment, the line between captor and captive, between enemy and ally, blurred into nothingness. They were two people from different worlds, bound together by a tapestry of death, debt, and deception. And they were facing a common enemy who would see them both destroyed. The vow made in the summer sun was no longer a future sentence. It was a present reality. Her survival was now intrinsically linked to his, and his honor was tied to her protection. As the punishing heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden days of autumn, a profound shift occurred on the small homestead. The dynamic, once defined by fear and dominance, slowly transformed into a partnership forged in shared necessity. Wexler's threat loomed over them, a storm gathering on the horizon, and the coming winter was a challenge they could only meet together. The Apache camp by the creek became a more permanent fixture. The warriors who had once been menacing statues were now figures of purpose. Under Natchok's direction, they began to help prepare the homestead for the harsh months ahead. Lorena would watch from her porch as they, with an efficiency that amazed her, rethatched the leaky roof of her barn, their movements economical and sure. They helped her harvest the last of the meager corn crop, their calloused hands working alongside hers. Language was a barrier, but not an insurmountable one. Through a combination of gestures, Natchok's clipped English, and the few Apache words she began to pick up, a unique form of communication developed. She learned the names of his most trusted warriors: Geronimo, a wiry older man with eyes that held a hint of humor, and Cochise, a young, intense brave who moved with the grace of a hunting cat. They in turn began to call her by a name she didn't understand at first. Iskishi, which Natchok later explained meant woman of the house. The days fell into a rhythm. Lorena would cook, making large stews from the game the men brought in, adding her own dwindling supply of beans and potatoes. She found herself cooking not just for one, but for a dozen, the simmering pot on her stove, a symbol of their strange, blended household. In the evenings, they would sometimes sit around a shared fire, the Apache men speaking softly in their own tongue, their voices a melodic counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets. It was during these quiet moments that the walls between Lorena and Natchok truly began to crumble. She would ask him about his people, their customs, their beliefs. He in turn would ask about her world, about the strange ways of the white settlers. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she found the courage to ask about the eagle feather in his hair. He touched it gently. It was a gift. From my wife, Narlin. It was the first time he had ever mentioned a wife. Lorena's heart gave a strange, unexpected pang, where she asked softly. He stared into the flames, his face a mask of old sorrow. She and our son. They were at a winter camp near the Gila River. Soldiers came. They said they were looking for warriors who had raided a freight wagon. But there were no warriors in the camp. Only women, children, and old men. It did not matter. They burned the camp. He fell silent, but his fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. Lorena's breath caught in her throat. He was a widower, too. He had lost his entire family, not to a fight between warriors, but to a massacre. He was a mirror of her own loss, his grief vaster and more violent than anything she had ever imagined. She saw now that his desire for a son was not just about fulfilling a blood debt for his brother. It was about reclaiming a future that had been burned to ashes, about planting a new seed of life in scorched earth. I'm sorry, she whispered the words, feeling pitifully inadequate. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not a chief or a warrior, but simply a man hollowed out by grief. Sorrow is a river that all people must cross, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It has drowned many. She told him about Frank then, Not the lie she had clung to for so long, but the truth. She told him about their dreams of building a life, of having children who would run through this valley. She spoke of his easy laugh and the way he held her, and then of her shame and anger at his betrayal. Nachok listened without interruption, his gaze steady and patient. When she was finished, her voice choked with tears, he simply nodded. He was a man caught between his dreams and his weakness, he said. Many men die in that place. An understanding passed between them deeper than any words. They were two survivors scarred by the same brutal land, their hearts holding the ghosts of those they had lost. The physical space between them also shrank. He began taking his evening meal on her porch instead of at the main campfire. She would bring him a plate, and they would sit in comfortable silence as the stars emerged in the vast velvet sky. She noticed the small things about him, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, when he was listening intently, the sheer size of his hands, and how gently he could handle a delicate object, the deep timbre of his voice, when he would occasionally hum a low, ancient-sounding melody. The fear she once felt had long since vanished, replaced by a profound and unsettling respect. And beneath that respect, something else was beginning to take root. Something warm and dangerous and utterly confusing. When he looked at her now, she no longer saw a threat. She saw a future, a terrifying, impossible future that she was no longer sure she wanted to resist. The vow, once a sentence of violation, now echoed in her mind with a different resonance. It was no longer about his justice. It was about their shared survival, about the creation of something new from the wreckage of their pasts. The first snows were not far off, and with them winter. And for the first time, Lorena Bishop was not afraid. The first snowflakes fell on a grim grey morning in late November, fat wet flakes that melted into the dust, but promised more to come. The air had a sharp metallic bite to it, the kind that heralded the true beginning of winter. The homestead was as ready as it could be. The barn was stocked with fodder, the cabin's gaps were chinked with fresh mud, and firewood was stacked high against the walls. A sense of tense anticipation hung over the valley. They were all waiting for Corbin Wexler to make his move. He came at dawn 2 days later. The attack was not subtle. Wexler rode at the head of nearly 20 men, a small army of hired guns and disgruntled ranch hands he'd likely plied with whiskey and promises of Apache gold. They came from the east, using the rising sun to their advantage, their rifles glinting. But Nachok had been expecting them. His warriors were not caught sleeping in their camp. They were already positioned, hidden among the rocks and brush that dotted the landscape around the cabin, a silent, deadly reception committee. The first volley of arrows took Wexler's men by complete surprise. 2 riders toppled from their saddles before a single shot had been fired. Chaos erupted. Shouts and curses tore through the morning, quiet followed by the roar of rifles. Lorena was inside the cabin, her heart pounding against her ribs like a war drum. Frank's Winchester was in her hands, its stock smooth and familiar. Beside her by the other window was Geronimo, the older warrior. Nachok had insisted 2 of his men stay to protect the cabin, to protect her. Bullets splintered the log walls and shattered the window panes. Lorena flinched but held her position. She saw one of Wexler's men trying to use the woodpile for cover. Taking a deep breath to steady her hands, she sighted down the barrel, just as Frank had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and the man screamed, clutching his leg as he fell. A grim satisfaction, cold and hard, settled in her. This was her home. She would not let them take it. The battle raged for over an hour. It was a brutal, swirling affair. Wexler's men had numbers and firearms, but Nachok's warriors had knowledge of the terrain, unparalleled stealth, and a cold, disciplined fury. She saw Nachok moving through the fray, a giant among men. He seemed to be everywhere at once, his war axe a blur of motion, his powerful form a rallying point for his warriors. He fought not with wild abandon, but with a focused, intelligent lethality that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. From her vantage point, Lorena could see the tide of the battle turn. Wexler's men were disorganized, their initial charge broken. They were being outmaneuvered and picked off one by one. Their numbers began to dwindle. Then she saw Wexler himself, his face a mask of rage and desperation. He had dismounted and was leading a small group in a direct charge toward the cabin. He knew if he could take the house, he would have a fortified position. "They are coming for the house." Geronimo grunted, loosing an arrow that sent one of the charging men stumbling. The men reached the porch. The door burst inward with a splintering crash. Lorena fired the Winchester at the first man through the blast, deafening in the enclosed space. He fell backward, but two more were right behind him. Geronimo met them with his knife, a whirlwind of desperate courage. Lorena scrambled back, trying to reload her fingers, clumsy with adrenaline. One of Wexler's men lunged for her, his face contorted in a vicious snarl. She swung the heavy rifle like a club, catching him in the side of the head. He staggered back, but his eyes were still on her. Suddenly the doorway was filled by Nachok. He was wounded, a bloody gash on his arm, but his eyes burned with a primal fire. He swept the man attacking Lorena aside with a single powerful blow from his axe handle, sending him crashing into a table. Then Wexler was there, pushing past his own man, his pistol aimed directly at Nachok's chest. "It's over, you savage," Wexler screamed, his voice cracking. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Nachok was too close to dodge his axe out of position. Geronimo was still struggling with another man. Lorena, her rifle empty, saw Wexler's finger tighten on the trigger. Without thinking, she lunged. She threw herself not at Wexler, but at Nachok, shoving his massive frame with all her might. Her momentum, combined with his surprise, sent them both tumbling to the floor, just as Wexler's pistol roared. The bullet meant for Nachok's heart tore through the fleshy part of his shoulder instead. Nachok grunted in pain, but he rolled with the fall, coming up onto one knee. Before Wexler could fire again, Nachok threw his war axe. It spun end over end, the stone head striking Wexler squarely in the chest with a sickening thud. The rancher's eyes went wide with shock, the pistol falling from his lifeless fingers as he crumpled to the ground. The fight was over. The remaining few of Wexler's men, seeing their leader fall, broke and fled. Silence descended, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the rising wind which now carried the snow in thick swirling sheets. The cabin was a wreck. The floor was stained with blood. Wexler's, his men's, and Nachok's. Lorena rushed to Nachok's side. He was leaning against the wall, his face pale beneath its copper hue. "You are hurt," she said, her hands hovering over the bullet wound in his shoulder. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "You saved my life. You saved mine," she replied, her voice trembling. She tore a strip from her petticoat and pressed it firmly against the wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. Their faces were inches apart. The smell of sweat, blood, and gunpowder filled the air. The battle for the land was over. But in that moment, looking into his eyes, Lorena realized another battle, the one inside her own heart, had also just been decided. He had vowed to take her to claim her as payment for a debt. But here in the bloody aftermath of a shared fight for survival, she understood the truth. He had not taken anything. Instead, he and this brutal, beautiful land had captured her heart. The choice was no longer his to make. It was hers, and she had already made it. The snow fell for 3 days, a thick, silent blanket that covered the scars of the battle and transformed the valley into a pristine, white wilderness. It buried the bodies of Wexler and his men, entombed the hatred and greed that had brought them there, and isolated the small homestead from the rest of the world. Inside the cabin, a new world was being born. Lorena cleaned and stitched Natchok's wounds, her hands surprisingly steady. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder, and while painful, it had missed the bone. As she worked, he sat stoically, his gaze never leaving her face, a silent testament to a trust that had been forged in bloodshed. His warriors, having tended to their own, kept a respectful distance, their quiet vigil, a sign of their loyalty to their chief and their acceptance of her new role. They were snowbound. The pass leading to Dust Devil Gulch would be impassable for months. They were alone together, a small island of humanity in a vast frozen sea. The cabin, once a symbol of Lorena's lonely grief, became a haven of warmth and life. The air was filled with the smell of wood smoke, simmering stew, and the herbal medicines Geronimo prepared for the wounded. The rigid lines that had separated them, white woman and Apache chief captive and captor, had been erased by the shared fight for their lives. They were simply a man and a woman, their pasts littered with ghosts, their future an unwritten page. On the 4th night after the last of the wounded had been settled, and a quiet peace had fallen over the cabin, Lorena found Natchok standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit snow. His arm was in a sling she had fashioned, but he stood tall and strong, a silhouette of enduring power. "The winter is here," he said, his voice a low rumble that filled the quiet room. "Yes," she replied, coming to stand beside him. The cold from the glass pane kissed her cheek. "We're safe now." For a while, he turned to face her. In the soft glow of the lantern, the hard lines of his face seemed to soften. His eyes, which had held so much sorrow and severity, now held a question. "The vow I made," he began, his voice hesitant for the first time she could remember. "It was made in anger and grief. It was the way of my people, a law of blood for blood. I did not understand. I did not know the woman I was speaking to." Lorena's heart beat a steady rhythm, no longer in fear, but in anticipation. And now she prompted softly. "Now," he said, reaching out with his good hand to gently touch her cheek, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender against her skin. "Now I would not hold you to a vow made in honor of the dead. I would ask you for a promise in honor of the living." He looked around the small, warm cabin at the life they had fought to protect. "This is your home, but you have made it a home for my people as well. You have shown a courage I have not seen in many warriors. You saved my life. The debt is gone, Lorena. You are free to choose." She looked up into his face, into the dark, deep eyes of the man who had terrified her, protected her, and ultimately shown her the truth of her own heart. He was offering her an escape, a release from the prophecy he had laid upon her months ago. He was giving her a choice, the one thing she thought she'd lost forever. And in that choice, she found her answer. "I was never free," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I was a prisoner of grief, a prisoner of a lie." You set me free, Natchok." She leaned into his touch, her hand coming up to cover his. "What you vowed in anger, I now choose in hope. I do not want to be the payment for a debt. I want to be the wife of the man who stood with me, who fought for me. I want to build a new life here with you." A slow smile spread across his face, a rare and beautiful thing that transformed his severe features. It was a smile of relief, of joy, and of a future finally within reach. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or dominance, but one of profound tenderness and respect. It was a silent seal on a new vow, a promise made not under the brutal sun of summer, but in the quiet, hopeful sanctuary of a winter's night. As the snow continued to fall, blanketing the land in a deep and cleansing peace, Lorena knew that the giant Apache's vow would come true. By winter's end, she would indeed carry his son. But it would not be the result of a savage's justice. It would be the beginning of a new bloodline, a new family born not from vengeance, but from a love as fierce and resilient as the land itself. And so, in the heart of a wilderness that had seen so much bloodshed and sorrow, a new story began to take root. The story of Lorena and Nachok is more than just a tale of the Old West. It's a testament to the human spirit's ability to find understanding in the face of hatred and love in the most unexpected of places. It reminds us that our true enemies are often not those who look different, but those whose hearts are filled with greed and prejudice. Theirs was a love forged in fire, sealed in snow, and destined to create a future that would bridge two worlds. If this story of unlikely love survival and the breaking of barriers resonated with you, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit the like button to let us know you enjoyed it, and share this video with someone who appreciates a powerful story. Most importantly, if you haven't already, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next journey into the dramatic heart of history. Thank you for listening.